Welcome to everyone from Bangkok. As I am Lia Shortino, Director and Founder of Southeast Asia, and today we have our 28th What's Happening in Myanmar updates. As you can see, we are also having an exhibition of quilt done by Rohingya women. We just opened 2 days ago and will still be here for 1 more week. So please do come and visit us in Bangkok. But today the program is online. And as usual, we have again Debbie, our old friend Debbie, the head of ASEAN and a very well-known activist for Myanmar as well as for the region. And she will give an update of what has been happening in Myanmar in this last month before we open up for question and answer. Please, Debbie.
Hi, everybody. First up, I'm going to share with you a PowerPoint. First up, happy International Women's Day for all our friends. Yesterday, I hope you had a good day, and just wanted to remember our sisters from Burma who are in prison, who are in the notorious interrogation centers, who are in IDP and refugee camps everywhere, including in the diaspora and exile. You know, you're not alone. We're here with you, and we are going to stand together for as long as this revolution continues. The month of February has been a tough month. AAPP, our cherished or partner organization, who's been doing a lot of important work, mainly, you know, political prisoners, former political prisoners, helping other political prisoners, and documenting and advocating for political prisoners and other people being threatened and attacked by the military junta, the illegal military junta, gave a very shocking statistic. In the month of February 2023 alone, the junta had sentenced 2,384 people to prison terms. That in that 1 month, the junta had sentenced half of the total number of people that it had illegally sentenced since the attempted coup started in 1st of February 2021. To give you an idea, between 1st February 2021 till the 31st of January 2023, the first 2 years of the coup, the junta had sentenced 2,299 people. And then in this past month, it sentenced 2,384 people. That is a very concerning and significant indicator that the junta is stepping up its violence. It is desperate, and it's even doing things such as making announcements to permit weapons to be given to those that support it. Basically, we are looking at the possibility, the threat of ordinary people or people in militias aligned to the junta being given weapons. And so we really need to be aware that some of the indicators that I'm going to share with you is telling us that this junta is about to step up repression in order to clean out the areas under its control of any possible dissent. So anyone hoping that the junta's proposed election, or what Min Aung Hlaing has been talking about, the illegal junta leader has been talking about, is a potential off-ramp to a potential way out of this ugly mess, need to have a reality check that it's going to get worse. And this is why targeted sanctions against this illegal junta are necessary so that they moderate their behavior. What is also kind of interesting is last month, the Economist Intelligence Unit's Democracy Index for 2022 rated Burma as the second least democratic country in the world for the second year in a row, behind Taliban-ruled Afghanistan. I say irony because for those of you who were around in 2015 and 2020, there was a lot of scaremongering by the military-backed U Wiratu, the extremist nationalist Buddhist monk, and his supporters, who went around distributing leaflets in Burmese, and also ended up warning people that electing Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD would actually lead to the country being overrun by Taliban-like Muslims and Rohingya. And that Aung San Suu Kyi was a Muslim sympathizer, and so trying to rile up the mainly Buddhist population to withdraw their support from the NLD. And now we see that the same military that backed Wiratu, that ultra-nationalist Buddhist monk who was guilty of so much hate speech and incitement against Muslims, has actually taken the country into the same direction as the Taliban in terms of its anti-democratic practices and its crackdown on democracy movement. And this is a big drop because prior to the coup in 2020, Burma was ranked 135 out of 167. And now it is all the way down to 166. Now, just to wrap up on political prisoners, on 31st of January, AAPP said regime forces had arrested at least 19,936 civilians and sentenced a total of 144 people to death. But if you ever want to have an important takeaway from the month of February, it's the fact that this junta has suddenly accelerated its jailing of people by sentencing over half the total number of people it's sentenced since the attempted coup started. So that's 2,384 people sentenced to prison in the past month alone. And that should be a sobering statistic. Now, going back to what we were talking about in terms of to what we're talking about in terms of the military junta increasing its it's increasing its violence, is that these are some statistics from the ACLED database, the Armed Conflict Location Event Database, that in the past 4 months, during October, November, December, January, and January I have a typo here. From October 2022 to February 2023, pardon the typo, the junta conducted 226 airstrikes, causing 221 fatalities, including 100 civilians. Now, what is interesting about this statistic is that in the same period, Ukraine had only half the number of airstrikes. Ukraine had 121 airstrikes. And although 664 people were killed in those airstrikes in Ukraine, none were recorded to be civilian. So it is actually quite stark to see this comparison that Burma had double the number of airstrikes and actually killed 100 civilians, whereas Ukraine had half the number of airstrikes and did not kill civilians. So it would appear, I mean, if this is a statistic that you need to use, it's one of the evidence that the junta has deliberately targeted civilians in their airstrikes. If you're not further convinced, here's another interesting bunch of statistics from ACLED. Now, this is looking at the number of air and drone strikes with civilian fatalities in October 22 to February 2023. And you can see in these months, Burma is the only country in Asia to launch airstrikes on civilians. We haven't seen airstrikes on civilians in those past few months in Syria or in Ukraine. We've seen them, we haven't even seen them in Afghanistan, but we've seen them in Burkina Faso, Ethiopia, Mali, Morocco, Nigeria, Somalia, and Yemen. And of all of this number, we can see that the largest number of airstrikes, air and drone strikes targeting civilians is 34. It's in Burma. So Burma is the only country in Asia to launch airstrikes on civilians. And in the past few months, it is the country that launched the largest number of air or drone strikes on civilians in the world. I think, you know, in previous sessions, I've actually talked about the fact that this junta has started this practice, besides its so-called normal brutality of raping and killing and torturing people. They started to burn people alive, and we saw some of the worst things the worst incidents happening in Sagaing, and also in Karenni State, which is on the eastern side of the country, particularly the Purcell Christmas Eve massacre, where over 30 men, women, and children were burned alive when they were intercepted by junta troops when in a convoy trying to get to a safe place for Christmas. Now, and we saw this trend happening in various other states and regions, people being burnt alive. A few weeks ago, the 3,000th person to have been civilian to have been killed by the junta was actually a Buddhist nun who was burned alive in her home during a military raid on her village. Now, what is also another disturbing trend is the military's what would seem to be a new practice of beheading people to cause even more terror and fear in the community amongst civilians and fighters alike. And I think it's really, really sad to see that two teenagers, in this case, were beheaded by junta troops in Sagaing on February the 26th. And in a separate incident from this article that I'm sharing with you here, another PDF leader told the media that two soldiers from his force were found beheaded following a February 27th battle with military troops. So we are actually, I think some folks might recall a couple of months ago, a teacher, a CDM teacher who continued to teach in a CDM school was himself caught and beheaded, and then his head left at the gate of the resistance school for his students to see. So I think we actually have, I think in July, when people saw the executions of 4 activists, including former MP Zayato and Kojimi, the veteran activist, we already saw that a threshold, a line had been crossed. But it's not the end. More and more lines are being crossed. And if we go back to the airstrikes and understand that airstrikes and drone strikes targeting civilians, that Burma in the past few months had the highest number of air and drone strikes targeting civilians, then it's pretty clear that we do need to have comprehensive targeted sanctions to prevent aviation and jet fuel from being given to the military. I'm going to stop here. This is the last slide in this collection, and there's going to be quite a few questions, I think, coming from the floor. And yeah, so I'm handing it over to you, Leah.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think we also have a small video So we are going to show the short video, just few minutes, and then we open indeed to the floor. And if there are people on Facebook also who want to ask questions, please do write. So this video is kind of a summary of the situation of the last 2 years. And indeed, the question is whether we are supporting enough for the democratic forces within Myanmar. Maybe a few questions. I think we talked a little bit before opening this update about the election. Still, the government seems, the junta, not the government, seems to be wanting to go ahead with the pseudo election. And you read here and there that some small parties are going, but the majority is very clear, is not willing to. Can you just give us some updates on that? And then a second point about ASEAN. there were quite a lot of expectation for Indonesia taking up the chair. I am aware also you have recently been in Indonesia, or you have been involved in conversation with Indonesian organization. What is going on there? We hear also rumors that when Laos people is already passing by Indonesia and going into Laos, and the concern is that Laos will give a greater role to the junta. Now, so maybe you can help us reflect on this, 2 points.
Thanks, Leah. Firstly, as I was just giving the presentation, I got an urgent message from my colleagues that the APP actually announced that this number of people had been sentenced during the month of February, but that also included previous sentences that they had missed. So it's not as dramatic as I thought it was, but it's still pretty scary. So we're tracking down the number, the actual number of people who were sentenced in February. So folks, sorry about that. APP did the original report and then realized that it had been misunderstood. And yes, we did misunderstand it. And we're going to try and find out in that over 2,800 people sentenced in according to APP records in the month of February, how many were previous cases that had not been entered and how many were actual cases. So stay tuned for that. Yeah. So this, there's will it or won't it? You know, last month, the illegal junta extended the state of emergency for a third time, for another 6 months until August. And one of the, and that apparently is against, I see Gwen Robinson in the background. Hi, Gwen. We had photo bombs before. Now we're getting
sorry,
bombs.
this is not
Crashing your meeting.
He's crashing into our
No, actually,
update.
I wanted to speak.
Anyway, don't worry. So I wanted to say that when the junta announced extension of the state of emergency, it was for the third time, which is actually against the military's drafted 2008 constitution. A lot of people thought that meant that the sham election being, or we call it the Ma election, since it's after Min Aung Hlaing, the Ma election will not happen this year. I think looking at what's happening on the ground and the fact that the junta is moving ahead with all kinds of preparations for this Ma election, we can see various parties re-registering under the junta's new so-called political parties registration law. We're seeing news about the Russia providing electronic voting equipment using parts from India, and some of the news reports talk about how voting electronically is going to be linked to your household data and your voter registration data. So if you actually boycott this election, you can be identified. So we see that the junta has been saying, oh, they've done most of the voter registration already. They've done most of the verification, etc., etc. And then on one hand, but then on the other hand, Min Aung Hlaing, the junta, the head of the illegal junta, saying, well, maybe we will, maybe we won't. Since he's claiming that the junta has stable control of only 60% of the townships in the country. And I think it's 198 out of 330. But you're gonna have to look at our coup watch, which is coming out tomorrow, to get all those details. But you'll probably see that he's still hedging his bets. They're moving ahead with all of the election prep but then he might try to use the fact that there's such a strong resistance, that so-called instability, they might they might reschedule the election. But having said that, I think what it's going to boil down to is how many more airstrikes and drone strikes this junta is going to be able to launch against the resistance and against civilian populations that are resisting the coup, in order to stamp out all dissent before they feel safe to have the election. And that's why, UK and Canada last month imposed targeted sanctions on aviation fuel to the junta. And I think the rest of the world should follow, because this is one way that we can actually save lives. Indonesia, Jakarta is like becoming, in the past few months, one of the most popular destinations for human rights activists. Concern on human rights in Southeast Asia, in ASEAN countries, but definitely in Burma. 2 weeks, the video that you saw earlier just now, we actually had the Bahasa Indonesia version of it launched when I was visiting Jakarta with my colleagues, including the ASEAN board chair, Yasmin Ullah, the Rohingya feminist. So the Bahasa Indonesia version was launched there 2 weeks ago. There's so much hope placed on Indonesia, because Indonesia is actually the largest democracy in ASEAN. It's one of the ASEAN big brothers, one of the first, one of the co-founders of ASEAN. And in many respects, Indonesia was almost in the same position as Burma was. It had a constitution that entrenched military political control, the military's role in political affairs, a constitution that was discarded in the late 90s after Reformasi, but was also what was then adopted by the military junta of the day in Burma and became the basis of the 2008 constitution. So I think we need to understand that, President Jokowi, Foreign Minister Retno Marsudi have made some pretty strong statements on the situation in Burma, Myanmar, but we still see they continue to engage with the illegal junta in a way that can be quite concerning, because in November, President Jokowi called for the ban on political representation. So this is the polite speak, to prevent the junta leader Min Aung Hlaing from coming and other junta representatives from coming to the ASEAN summit and the ASEAN foreign ministers meeting. But at the same time, in November, President Joko Widodo actually said we should extend this ban on political representation to all the other ASEAN meetings. That's in November. Then in February and in March, we keep getting news that the junta reps have been invited to various meetings of ASEAN in Indonesia. So does Indonesia speak with forked tongue, or are things so chaotic that they are actually disregarding the president's call, their own president, or have they changed tactics? The reality is this is not a situation that's going to be solved by a classical, let's bring everyone to the peace talk table and somehow give them enough food and drink and luxurious accommodation so that they get softened up and they feel willing to talk. This junta is going around beheading people, burning people alive, launching air and drone strikes on civilians, the only country in Asia to do so, and also the country to launch the largest number of air and drone strikes on civilians in the world. It is not going to be likely that the junta is willing to speak, and rightfully, it's not going to be in the interest or in the mood of the people representing affected communities, the civilians, the resistance, to say, okay, let's talk. The reality is that the junta will only speak when its position is weakened. I think in the past I've said that the trend of all the peace processes in the country, in Burma in the past, has been that prior to any peace talk, the junta will step up violence and attacks, include especially on civilians, before the peace talk with that particular group or with that range of ethnic groups. And it's to actually um, um, subjugate the ethnic groups in the peace talks so that they will be speaking from a position of weakness. That's why we often, I remember putting out a joke press release calling for war talks so that civilians would suffer from less attacks. But the reality is that this is the way the junta thinks. And the only reason the junta will go into these talks and actually behave itself and moderate its behavior is if it is in its interest to do so. If it is weakened, then they might feel the need to engage in peace talks. But at this time, they still have the means. They still have the revenue. They still have the aviation fuel, and they still have the weapons to attack civilians. So Indonesia is going to have to toughen up. And, you know, we're getting so many mixed messages. When Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim met with President Joko Widodo in Indonesia a few weeks ago, they both agreed that they have to put more pressure on the junta. And then we're seeing suddenly some of the statements being like very, very weakened and diluted. And we need to understand that individual ASEAN member states might make statements, but when it comes to a joint statement of ASEAN, it's going to be watered down until it's 10% of what the chair originally said, because it's a consensus statement. And earlier this year, Indonesian Foreign Minister Retno Marsudi actually spoke out because Thailand was hosting a breakaway meeting for the Myanmar illegal regime with Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. So we are not just talking about CLMV, we're actually talking about CLMVT. And basically trying to undermine ASEAN's original consensus at the ASEAN summit in November, which is reflected in the ASEAN leaders' statement. Basically calling out the illegal junta. Well, they call it the regime or the Myanmar Armed Forces. It was President Joko Widodo who actually referred to the junta as the junta. But in the statement, it actually refers to the Myanmar Armed Forces. It stopped calling it the SAC, or they stopped calling it the authorities in Myanmar. And so we could see that they did call out the junta, especially reminding them of their obligation to implement the 5-point consensus and to also particularly to reduce the violence. Now, the he said, she said situation is continuing when it comes to the 5-point consensus. Indonesia sees the 5-point consensus as its baby. It's not going to mess around with the 5-point consensus. The 5-point consensus came out of the April 24, 2021 meeting hosted by Indonesia on behalf of the then ASEAN chair, Brunei, who basically was not sure how to deal with the situation because Brunei is a very lucky country. They just have one sultan. They claim they have no human rights violations, and also no conflict. So they just didn't know how to deal with the situation. And everyone, all the ASEAN governments actually sat on their asses thinking that Min Aung Hlaing was going to deliver. Min Aung Hlaing said, we're going to have this coup and then everything will be okay by Songkran or by Tinjan, which is April. And then the water festival came and went. and 2 months later, 3 months later, and then ASEAN went, oh shit, we have to do something. The situation is actually not under control. And so they hosted this meeting in Jakarta, came out with the 5-point consensus, and then everyone said, oh, great, we have a 5-point consensus. They forgot about releasing the political prisoners, and the Rohingya were quickly swept under the carpet. Nobody had said the R word in the meeting. And then everyone self-congratulated themselves. And then Min Online got on the plane and flew back and said, we will think about the 5-point consensus when we are in control, fully in control. And in the meantime, ASEAN saying, no, you agreed. And Min Online said, I didn't say anything. And ASEAN said, we all know in ASEAN, if you don't say anything, it means yes. So we're having this kind of he said, she said situation. Min Online says, I did not agree to any such thing. And they said, because you kept quiet, it means yes. And so we have this messy 5-point consensus, with Min Online and the illegal junta just dismantling in the most embarrassing way. And let's see how, I mean, when we're talking with Indonesia, the chair, we're saying, hello, excuse me, since you don't want to kill your baby, and now you've decided to have this plan to implement an implementation of the 5-point consensus, like 2 years later, okay, you don't want to give it up. Oh, how do we give it CPR? Okay, let's write an implementation plan. Oh, that's what the problem was. You actually made a consensus without a plan. All right. So we go to Indonesia and everyone's saying, like, if you're making a plan, can you please include the resistance and the elected MPs? Can you please include the Rohingya? Can you listen to the affected communities? Because at this point, they are the ones most likely to be able to implement the 5-point consensus, or at least do the monitoring. One interesting meeting that I had recently was, after all of this data, we've been churning out this data, reformatting and extracting stuff from the ACLED database, which tracks global conflicts all around the world, and giving it to ASEAN leaders and ASEAN and saying, hello, excuse me, failing, too many conflicts. Look, we're up there. We're up there with all these other global conflicts that you're worried about. And this is happening in your front yard. The pressure now on the junta was to tell ASEAN embassies in Yangon that the number of conflict incidents have reduced in the past few months, but the number of people killed have been increased. So I don't know whether it's saying that we are less violent or we're becoming more lethal, because the number, according to the information that's listed in that's being circulated officially around the missions, the foreign missions in Yangon, in the past 3 or 4 months, the number of conflict incidents have gone down, and we're seeing that, but the number of people being killed has gone up. And so there's this whole thing of, we got to get the Indonesian strategy strong enough so that it has momentum to coast through the Laos in 2024 and be taken up by Malaysia when Malaysia chairs in 2025. Whereas CLMVT is saying, let's just politely ignore Indonesia and wait for Laos to take over the chair, and then we can have a party. So it's actually, I would say this, if it wasn't for the fact that we have people dying on the ground, people being tortured, people being beheaded, burned alive, even IDP camps are being bombed. If it wasn't for that, this would be actually quite a funny story. But then you have this farcical situation, these dynamics at ASEAN level, and all kinds of strange statements and arguments and counter arguments, and then on the ground the reality is horrific. So I think we do need to understand what's going on, but we also do need to criticize and ask Indonesia to put its money where its mouth is. It's time for Indonesia to front up and be much more consistent, from president to foreign ministry to the officials and the diplomats in the foreign ministry.
Yeah, I think one issue with ASEAN is that although the higher up in the junta are not invited, there are representatives from Myanmar invited at the lower administrative level, but they are present. So it's not like if Myanmar is not present. I think this is probably one of the diplomatic way that ASEAN deals. So actually it has not ousted everyone from Myanmar, just the top up. And that, of course, so Myanmar still talks and has still a voice in the discussion, and being based on consensus. Of course, if they veto something, even if vetoed by a lower official, is still vetoed as far as ASEAN is concerned. So that is quite problematic. But we have one question which relates to your last point, which is indeed how, I mean, the things that are happening are really terrible, atrocity, but how we convince the world, this is the question. What can Myanmar people should do more to let the international community get more concerned about the increasing number of atrocity that is happening, beheading, raping, and all these horrible things which are really not human in many regards. So what the Myanmar, the question is what the Myanmar people, but I would say also what is us as activists, what can we do more? Because we seems not to be able to really show the world that what is happening is really beyond any measure of humanity.
I think for friends in Indonesia, now that we are pushing out resources in Bahasa Indonesia to share that more openly and more widely in the mainstream social media, and to get more public awareness in Indonesia on what's happening in Myanmar, Burma. I think that's going to be quite important because let's face it, Indonesia is heading to a general election and presidential election in February next year. That's just 11 months away. So if those in power, those people who are looking for votes, see that this is an issue of public concern, then they will be more active on it. I think that's one thing. But that's at the ASEAN level. But I think we do need to seriously consider how we can translate and help translate and help disseminate a lot of this information. I think many people are quite clueless because we are all looking at the for the past year, we've just been looking at mainstream international media coverage of Ukraine without realizing that the number of the number of conflict-related deaths, including civilians and combatants, at the end of January became slightly higher in Burma than in Ukraine. And if people are concerned, Indonesia has been, kind of obsessed about economic recovery. And in fact, their tagline for the ASEAN chair is ASEAN Matters Epicentrum of Growth. If you have a war raging in an ASEAN country of 54 million people, which previously, prior to COVID, was one of the fastest growing economies in ASEAN, then you're basically fucked. You cannot talk about economic growth and economic recovery in this region if you have war and and economic chaos in the country. It is being basically what's happening in Burma is dragging down the rest of the region in terms of post-COVID economic recovery. So I think it's time for ASEAN to take a reality check. It has been easy for the UN Security Council and for other key states in the international community to give lip service, to occasionally put in some sanctions, but not in a coordinated global fashion. But still, we still need those targeted sanctions. We just wish that everybody else would do it as well, so that it had maximum impact on the junta. But they had been very conveniently delegating responsibility to ASEAN, saying, oh, we support regional leadership, we support the 5-point consensus, let ASEAN get on with it. And to be honest, ASEAN can't be effective if half of the ASEAN members are conspiring to undermine any strategy to reduce the violence and to restore democracy to Burma. You know, it's basically ASEAN, they said, let ASEAN lead. How do you lead when you're sitting on one hand?
Yeah, no,
Basically,
beyond ASEAN, I think the question was more general, really, to
I
show
think
how
get the word
horrific,
out.
yeah,
Get the
how
word out.
horrific.
Help people understand the situation in Ukraine is critical, but so is the situation in Burma. And there are so many ways that we can help. The biggest challenge is civilian protection, both in and outside the country. We have so many people in exile or asylum seekers having fled the country, the violence in the country. And when you look at the airstrikes, you see that people in Burma, the refugees, are not fleeing, fighting in their area. They are actually fleeing for their lives because they are the target of the military junta. So, you know, it's a little bit different. It's not like, oh, we see some fighting there and oh, let's leave to avoid trouble. No, it's like those people are actually coming after you and you need to flee for your life. And we need ASEAN states, especially the neighboring states, particularly Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, etc., to actually stop harassing refugees and to allow them to have civilian protection because they cannot get civilian protection in their country. We're also seeing the junta interfering and blocking aid. Besides attacking civilians, blocking aid to them, which is yet another war crime, attacking civilians and then blocking aid to them. But we've also seen that there are so many amazing and courageous and innovative, smart people on the ground being able to get aid to those who need it. So they're doing it very often with donations from the diaspora. So if you can help these groups, please do so. Even more importantly, if you can convince INGOs and governments to actually provide the aid directly to these grassroots organizations who are able to collect the money on the border and send in money and materials to help people protect themselves and their children, then that's what's needed. I mean, just the fact that hundreds of thousands of children have not been vaccinated in the past 2 years is quite scary when you think of it in terms of public health. So there's so much you can do. And if you are a citizen of a country that's democratic, please write to your member of parliament and please write to your head of government and your foreign minister to say, what the hell are you doing on Burma? You need to get aid to the community groups that are actually doing the work. You need to impose targeted sanctions to block revenue, aviation fuel, and both hardware and software that can be used for military purposes. And you need to actually make more of a noise at UN and ASEAN level.
Yeah, so this may be the last question about Myanmar fatigue. There is a feeling that even among the donor, they are cutting now on funds that were originally allocated for Myanmar. Now they are cutting their budget, so the number of organizations in Thailand have seen a change in the direction. What they were planning can no longer be undertaken. But more generally, of course, the public attention all over the world is taken by many other things, and it's very difficult to continue to keep the attention for Myanmar after 2 years. Any thoughts about what can be done indeed to counter this Myanmar fatigue, how to do it, how to ensure that still continue attention, the public attention as well as donor attention, as well as the international community attention is continue to be given even more, actually, because like you say, it's becoming even more terrible what is happening within Myanmar with less attention outside of Myanmar.
Look, the Economist Intelligence Unit's Democracy Index that I shared with you, that Burma, Myanmar is the second least democratic country in the world after after Taliban control Afghanistan, should be a scary enough piece of information. We cannot afford to have some kind of Afghanistan-like situation in this region. We cannot, we already have North Korea. We have North Korea on one side of our region, on the east side. We can't have Burma on the west side of our region. This type of Burma to continue to deteriorate and continue to continue to destabilize both economic and human security, economic stability and human security in the region. I think that is something that that we are missing in terms of our regional leadership. The regional leadership has been primarily politely ignoring Burma in the hope that the junta will kill enough people and take over the country and stabilize it. But they haven't woken up to the realities that the biggest threat to stability is the junta itself. And I think this is why we do need to ramp up the pressure and not just targeted sanctions against the junta, but also support to people on the ground. If the governments of our region were worried about COVID, did they notice that various public health authorities are on standby and monitoring? What's that the biggest fear is a COVID variant coming out of Burma, given the fact that this junta has treated health workers as public enemy number one, both health workers and education workers as public enemy number one, because they were the significant elements of the civil disobedience movement. They were killing health workers in the streets and attacking health facilities in the middle of a COVID pandemic. So what do you think is going to happen to this region if we don't step up resources and care and pressure to halt to reduce the violence? It's going to bounce back on us. This is a monster that we are creating. So I think donors, need to pay more attention than 2 years. The reality is this resistance is based on a couple of decades of investment in human rights and democratic education. This helped contribute to a more informed and a more robust civil society, especially amongst young people and women. This is why this coup is not succeeding. If this coup is allowed to succeed, we are going to have a huge human security problem and economic instability in our region, in our lap. This is not just a question of Burma. This is a question of what's going to happen to our region. And I think, it's easy for donors who are located or headquartered outside of the region to say, oh, we're tired. We already spent 2 years on this. But many of those donors actually spent a couple of decades invested in democratic transition. So a couple more years of assistance to make sure that their decades of investment pays off makes more sense. It's unreasonable and illogical to pull out at this time. And what they are doing by doing that is actually enabling and empowering a brutal junta to do worse.
Okay, so I think the message is quite clear, and we are going to conclude this update, this particular update. We will meet again. Oh, sorry.
I just wanted to say, with the number of political prisoners, 2,384 were not sentenced in the space of 1 month. There was quite a few that were sentenced, but that number included people who were previously sentenced who were not recorded in the statistics. So now we know for sure that double the number of people. We previously thought only 2,299 people had been sentenced to prison in the past 2 years, but actually the real number is double, or the verified number is double. It's 4,683 people sentenced to jail. And that's probably in the months ahead, we're going to probably find out that maybe that wasn't the right number, that actually it's much more than that. So, again, let's not forget what is happening in Burma is happening every day, every hour, and every minute. And the people on the ground resisting this coup deserve our support.
Thank you for the clarification. And so indeed, the number now has been made clear. That the statement in the beginning was that in February so many people, but now it's been clarified that that is a sum of also people that were condemned before, but then not taken notice at the time. So, but that is still a tragic result, that so many people are still in jail and so many people are condemned to death officially. And we know what is happening also inside those jail, all the atrocity that are happening there. So hopefully that can be freed as soon as possible. So with this, we will continue, in spite of fatigue on Myanmar, we will continue to go on with the update. And I hope to see you on the 11th of April, again with Debbie for the next updates on what is happening of Myanmar. Once more, thank you very much, Debbie, for keeping the spirit up and continuing to make it clear why we need to care about Myanmar. It's not only for Myanmar, it's for democracy in the region as well as beyond the region. So thank you again, all of you, and see you 11th of April at 4 o'clock.
And don't forget to visit Sea Junction for the Rohingya quilt exhibition. It's gorgeous, folks. So if you're in Bangkok, you really have to see it.
Yes, you can see it. It's a very nice, and there are more that are not here in the monitor. So please do come if you are in Bangkok. Thank you for reminding me. Bye-bye.
See you next month. Bye.
Bye.
Take care.